Just as a reminder, so this afternoon we have 3 panels in succession. This one that I'm about to introduce, and then the next one will be on issues of selection and placement, and then the last one of the day will be on classroom teaching and learning and the role of assessment. And then I think we have in mind to have dinner. Is that correct? Yes, we will reward ourselves with a nice dinner tonight. I'm not sure exactly how this happened, but it turns out that both papers and our discussant it's all economists. I don't think this was actually planned exactly that way. Although I'm a recovering economist, and so maybe that's how this partly happened. And it's at some point it would be interesting just to think for a moment about why it is that the question of accountability seems to be of particular interest and relevance with economists. I'm not sure about that. In any event, I'm very glad that Susanna Loeb and Rick Hanyashek have written papers for this volume. Great friends, great colleagues, and leading experts on the issues related to system and school level, I suppose, accountability. So we'll start with Susanna.
Yep.
And then Rick and Dick Murnane will be the discussant for both papers.
Okay, let's see if I have the technological expertise to do this. Okay, there we go. That's one. Does this move it? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the role of assessments in accountability, particularly from a state perspective and accountability for school performance. I'm going to kind of step back and say what some of the alternatives are and why you might turn to accountability that uses measures of student performance or school performance. So states have basically had the responsibility for oversight. They have the legal responsibility in the United States. But while they're responsible in law, they often have limited capacity and perhaps desire to actually manage individual schools, and most states delegate a large portion of the responsibility for running schools to local education agencies. So, and those can have a range of different sizes of schools, but this is just to get us right on the same page. So LEAs have the advantage of being closer to schools and thus better knowing the local context in their jurisdiction. But if the state just said, okay, each local education agency has complete control over what happens, we likely get a lot of inequality across places due to differences in capacity and also a lot of different purposes for schools. And so if the state has some goals for schools, they might want to have some ways of oversight to kind of push the local education agencies towards their goals for what they want to do. Even though they don't want to manage the minutia of the day-to-day running of schools. Okay, so states thus use a range of forms of oversight over the local jurisdictions. So measures. State oversight often includes some kinds of standardized measures of school performance designed to provide relative information for assessing the extent to which these local actors are kind of going in the direction the state wants them to go in. Now, no measures are perfect. So they use measures, but no measures are going to be perfect. They may not accurately reflect true performance, so it might not be accurate, so they're unreliable. It might not measure the performance over the things they care about, and so it might not be valid. And it might not also cover all the things that states care about, all the different value domains. In that way, it won't be comprehensive. So there are issues of it not being reliable, not being valid for state goals, and not being comprehensive for the range of state goals. So given the shortcoming of any measure, the questions arise of whether the available measures are providing any worthwhile information to the state for decision making about how the local jurisdictions are doing in reaching state goals, and would additional measures or alternative measures be beneficial? So is it worthwhile having the measures that we have, and are there other measures that we'd like to have that will help us as a state make decisions while the local jurisdictions are controlling their schools? Okay, so this is just basically to provide a framework for how I think anyway about how assessment for accountability relates to kind of the general way that schools are governed. So I want to provide a framework for considering the use of standardized measures for the oversight of schools, and I want to focus on both the role of kind of the array of educational goals that states have and the measurement options in determining whether or not these measures are a good thing or not. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do in this paper. Oh, I didn't even say, this paper is really largely written by my co-author, Erica Byung, and she couldn't come here. She was up there on the first slide, but she couldn't come here today, and I'm really sorry because she probably would do a better job of presenting this to you than I am. Okay, so we've got states and they're trying to oversee schools. There are a bunch of forms of oversight that states can use, and not all of them require standardized measures of performance. Okay, so for example, states can use regulatory policies. While they give districts or local education agencies control of schools, they can provide very strict guidelines. They can say your class size has to be this size or smaller. They can say teachers have to have this kind of credential, those kinds of things that hopefully provide a base for quality and some kind of similarity across schools in the state. One of the problems is that regulation is not necessarily designed well for things like continuous improvement. So it doesn't help the districts get better over time or kind of go above the goals that these regulations set, but it's certainly one kind of policy, and all states use this for overseeing schools. But sometimes we want to try to, the state wants to try to do things in the local area that isn't just setting a floor. So other forms of oversight aim to improve quality above this kind of floor. And one of them is political accountability. You set up school boards, you do things like that. You create systems of local participation that is supposed to kind of help the quality of schools. The school boards, again, have that better use of local understanding of needs, but again, communities vary in capacity, and I think we've seen that political accountability has not necessarily provided some of the quality of educational opportunity or even the level of educational opportunity that we might want. But that's one way of oversight, and states do that. And then there's market-based accountability, so charter schools and vouchers, and even just the ability to choose across districts gives individuals options, and in that way it might kind of push, as long as the state goals are kind of a sum of the individual goals, of the parents' goals, this kind of market-based accountability states could set up so that schools feel pressure to move towards the state goals. And again, we do worry that parents vary in their understanding of the schools of the kind of the characteristics of schools that would best serve their kids in the long run. And that again leads to some kinds of inequalities and maybe not the kind of quality we want. Okay, so political and market approaches might not be sufficient because communities vary in their technical capacity and their preferences. And parents vary dramatically in their abilities, and so states may want to directly measure progress towards the goals that they have, and then either directly intervene, and maybe some of this monitoring. I think the line between monitoring and accountability is actually not a very clear line, because once you put information out there, that creates kinds of pressures for things, and you might just call that accountability. And I think most of the accountability we've had in the US has really been driven just by this kind of information. But anyway, the states may want to measure things and not just leave it to markets or to political accountability to make sure that there is the kind of equality and quality that they're looking for in their systems. Okay, and then they can use it either to directly intervene or to kind of create incentives for moving forward. And measures in some ways can help help the state determine whether schools are building the capacities in students that society values and utilizing resources in a good way towards those goals. Okay, so this is kind of what I'm going to be calling administrative accountability. And this kind of administrative accountability may supplement other forms of oversight. So unlike regulations and political and market-based accountability, administrative accountability necessitates evidence of the alignment with state goals, of you're moving towards state goals. And I think of that as what we're talking about here with kind of test-based or measurement-based, assessment-based accountability. And I think we've done it in a bunch of different ways, and I don't think in the overall framework it doesn't matter. You can measure outcomes for students, or you could say these are the kinds of processes in schools that I think are needed in order to get to the goals that we have. So let's say the goal for the state is that all students have certain kinds of experiences. That might be a goal, and it might be better measured by process. The kind of underlying goal for the state is unlikely to be a score on a math test. It's like some kind of knowledge for kids that you care about. So I think administrative accountability could have process-based measures or outcome-based measures, and we can think of those things kind of similarly in this framework, though they have relative merits, advantages and disadvantages. Okay. So, administrative accountability creates oversight by measuring student outcomes or school processes and providing incentives or interventions based on those measures. It necessitates evidence of alignment with state goals. Test performance measures, which is what we've been talking about here, is one kind of these kinds of measures, and these tests are invariably imperfect, but the question remains whether or not they're useful. So I think that that's probably my main point. Yes, the measures are not perfect, but are they useful? Okay, so the uses of tests. Measures can be used for a variety of purposes in administrative accountability. We can use them again for identifying schools to intervene in. We can create carrots. We can create sticks. But I guess I shouldn't have gone on to that quite yet, but they can just be used with other forms of oversight to provide information. So if you provide this information, like in monitoring, that can support political accountability. School boards then know what they're doing relative to what another place is doing, or parents then know what the different schools are doing based on either these processes or outcomes. Okay, for more direct accountability for schools, you can either use it to provide information that helps political accountability and market-based accountability, or you can use it on its own in something like NCLB, where you provided information on schools. Either you made it very publicly available, or you targeted some schools given the test scores and then intervened in there. The QRIS in early childhood is another example of this, and I just wanted to mention that one because NCLB tends to use student outcome measures, QRIS systems, the quality review and information systems, I guess. For early childhood, they tend to use things like class, the process measures. Nonetheless, they're measuring quality. They're creating star systems or something like that judges places, and they put in some kinds of incentives, often greater amounts of reimbursement per kid if you do well on those. Okay. So test measures may be problematic. They might not, the standards that they're based on underneath it all may not reflect state goals. And there's some work that basically goes through the standards and says, do the tests align with the standards, and are the standards any good? But even if the test measures are aligned with the standards, they might not be sufficiently valid, reliable, or comprehensive. For reliability, if a test has too much error, it provides very little information for decision making. So if you have a test that basically doesn't tell you anything, you don't want to use the test. Okay, so that's a very simple way of doing it. But there's a little bit more to it than that. So that's basically like if you tell them to, if you reward people for doing well on a test, but the test doesn't mean anything, it's not very helpful. But even if it tells you something, if there's a lot of measurement error, it just becomes very frustrating for the people who are trying to respond to it, to respond and actually make progress. And so even if there's some information in it, holding people accountable to outcomes with a lot of measurement error may have kind of negative consequences. All measures have some error, but when there's so much error, it can be too frustrating to be positive. Okay, so that's reliability, validity, the measures not be valid for intended use. So let's say we're just talking about a student test score. Maybe we want the test score to know students' skills in algebra. And if what our goal is to see is if kids across the state are having the same opportunities to learn algebra, then a measure of algebra may be valid for that. If our goal is to understand whether schools are helping kids learn algebra effectively, and there's equality of schools across the state, a measure of student score in algebra may not be sufficient for that. So you want to think about what your goals are and what you measure for whether or not it's valid. A measure that's valid in one case might not necessarily be valid in another. Okay, so that the way that the data and information are organized by means, by subgroups, all affects the validity of the data for a specific use. So you want to think, of course, when you're looking at these, what is it valid for? It's not like there's a measure that's valid or not valid. So comprehensiveness, and I think this is not dealt with enough. Measures may not be suitably comprehensive to capture the processes towards all stated goals, and in fact, they never are. So no single measure is going to capture all the things we care about in a state, and even in combination, no set of measures is going to do that. So you have to choose which measures you go for. And in choosing them, you're making some specific choices. So sometimes the preference for different measures comes from a concern that those goals are not being met. So here I am, a state, I'm looking across schools, and I say, oh, okay, the kind of sufficiency of soccer seems to be being met. There's a sufficient, but however, no, they're not getting enough, I don't know, mindfulness work. So let's try to measure mindfulness and work towards that. And so I think it could come from a belief that it's not being met, and so you want to measure it, or from a belief that the chosen goals are the most important goals, at least for what the role is as a state in equalizing. So you might care, for example, that all kids are literate and numerate because that ends up, actually, I think I might do this. Okay, so there's a limited scope of available measures. Once you limit the scope, you have unintended consequences. So schools may choose to focus on improvement in one area without improvement in another. If performance on measured domains kind of reflects performance overall, then you don't have to worry about comprehensiveness, but if it moves in the other direction, you have to worry about it. Okay. So I wrote a book recently with 3 other co-authors about all the things that the state may think of, and we have these different kinds of, I'll just get rid of those, capacities that the state might care about in individuals: economic productivity, democratic competence, healthy personal relations, personal autonomy, personal fulfillment, treating others as equal. States may have goals around all of these things, and so when we're thinking about the use of measures, we want to think, okay, well, what in here do we want our schools to do, and if we're not measuring some of them, what should we be looking at? So given their imperfections, can standardized measures of performance be useful for decision making? So we know measures are problematic, but without them, school boards wouldn't know whether their district is providing the kinds of opportunities that other school districts are providing, or whether there's some groups of students that are learning less than others. You know, they're things that you don't learn at all. Parents, when choosing where to live, whether to attend a charter school or which one, would only have their observation and views of their acquaintances to help them with their choices. So the test of whether measures are useful is then whether they lead to better decisions. Okay, so that is the kind of super insight, which I'm sure is very controversial of this paper. Okay, so outcome-based accountability in general has somewhat improved, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, student test performance. And we can disagree on this, but I think in general the results show either not much improvement, a little improvement on test performance, okay? There's far less information on the effects on other goals. It's not surprising given it's the things we don't measure. We know there's more time spent on tested subjects, so we know some indication that there may be negative effects on other things. But the causal studies that have looked at this, at least on like test performance in other subjects or in social emotional skills, have not really found causally negative effects of these on these other kinds of outcomes, though qualitative and other kinds of descriptive studies have shown a great deal of variation, so that there's almost certainly groups of students with negative effects of these, even though on average the kind of large-scale things haven't found these negative effects. There have been some studies on some positive effects on processes, particularly on things like scheduling and having more professional development and those kinds of things. Okay, so tests can also be used to measure teacher performance. We can use the same framework. We don't do this much in the paper. The measures are problematic, but are they useful? And with the recent focus on teacher accountability, value-added models have been used to measure teacher performance. And here I don't think the results are as positive. Not that for schools it's overwhelmingly positive, but it's even worse for teachers. So I think, if anything, that there's really no evidence that these have increased performance. The ones based solely on student test performance. But once you get observational measures in and you talk about practices and stuff, I think it looks much more promising. So in this, it says, this is like an example of where a test may be, one kind of assessment may provide positive results where another kind of assessment might not. And of course, there's something about how you use those. Okay. So tests can have other administrative accountability uses. They can provide insights into policies and programs. So you get these tests, and then I can see whether not only, this LEA is doing well, but I can see whether as a state, if I put in a class size limit, that was beneficial or not. So there could be information stuff that these kind of tests provide. And they can also signal what a state, what a state cares about. So aside from anything else, regardless of the kind of, does it affect this particular district more than that because I held them more accountable, that's one thing. But overall, it's a signal of what a country cares about. So in conclusion, the strength of using standardized measures from school performance ultimately depends on their reliability, validity, and comprehensiveness. If lack of information is inhibiting decision-making, then such measures may be beneficial despite their imperfections, and evidence to date gives both optimism and caution in creating measures that lead to improvement and to better decisions. Thank you.
How do I do it?
I might not be very good at this, but. And then this is, oops, nope, I want to do the slideshow. There we go.
So this, thanks. I appreciate Susanna's sort of broader view. I'm a very narrow economist. We're all economists, but I'm a very narrow economist. And what I want to talk about is very simple. I'm going to argue that test-based accountability has had very positive impacts on things we care about, particularly economic outcomes across individuals, nations, and other places, states. And that there's no obvious alternative to the test-based accountability that we have. And so I'll lay that out as a starting point. What I want to do is quickly go through some evidence that we have that the tests we have that have been maligned, and they're not very good as far as I can tell, but the tests that we have, in fact, have a lot of information in them that is valuable information. And that the discussions that, well, we had to do away with testing because social, emotional skills are what counts, or maybe we should have deeper learning as opposed to these narrow tests. I'm going to argue that that's an interesting research question, but we know a lot more that these tests do matter. So that's how I'm going to start, and then I'll talk a little bit about the evidence on accountability and use of these tests. How do I do this? So the first thing, this is a small-scale economics lecture. So if you don't want that, you might go out for coffee or something. The economists have, for the last quarter of a century in particular, tried to understand why economic growth rates differ across countries. And it turns out that economic growth rates are all that matter in terms of the long-run economic well-being of a nation. Differences in growth rates determine where a country will be 25 or 50 years from now. And what I'm going to say is there's a very simple story there. This is the simple story that says that what I call knowledge capital, the aggregate knowledge of a country as measured by the standardized international test scores, starting with the FIMS test in 1964 through PISA in beginning of PISA. If you put those all together, get a measure of the aggregate knowledge of a country, and relate that on the horizontal axis are test scores. I'll explain conditional in a second. And on the vertical axis are growth rates. And what you see is that the countries, these are all countries of the world, they scatter quite nicely around there. For all those who are looking intently to find the U.S., there it is. Conditional means that this is based upon a regression that it has in the background the starting achievement, the starting income level of a country. This is economic growth rates in GDP per capita from 1960 to 2000. And we have 1960 income in there for one simple reason. If you start behind, it's easy to grow fast because all you have to do is copy what everybody else does. If you start ahead, you have to invent new things, and that's harder. And it also has years of schooling in the background here at school attainment. What I'm going to argue is that school attainment for many purposes is just a terrible measure, and that policies based on years of schooling are bad. And I'm going to try to demonstrate that simply in terms of growth, and we can talk about it later on other things. So here's what the same picture would look like if you compared years of schooling to growth rates. You get a similar positive line. You'll notice that the countries are a little bit farther from that line. Actually, this regression on years of schooling and growth rates and starting GDP per capita, it has an R squared of 0.25. The picture I gave you in the last diagram has an R squared of 0.75. So you can explain almost all of the differences in growth rates by the knowledge that you see of the people in different countries. The other thing about this is the standard economist view, and on top of the positive line and scattered around, what you should know that this is entirely wrong. If I just take into account what countries actually know in terms of their test scores, you get a perfectly flat line. That years of schooling don't matter. It took me a long time to understand this. It says if you go to school and don't learn anything, it doesn't count. And that's what this picture says. The important thing also, so this explains countries, and the line that I showed you on test scores is very, very steep. It has a big impact. But you see the same line if I look across states. If I take and calculate actually what the workforce in each state looks like. It's not the test scores in each state, but it's the workforce. So you have to allow for people moving around and so forth and coming in from abroad. And you find the same picture, is that the long-run economic interests of states is entirely dependent upon the quality of their workforce. Or not entirely, but it helps to find shale oil in your country, in your state. But beyond that, the really systematic thing is what people know in each state. Now, we'll go to looking at individuals. So this is the PIOC data that was discussed earlier this morning. What you see is countries are arrayed by what is the return, economic return to individuals of having higher test scores. And what you'll see here is that the US is right at the top, which says two things. One, it says that the rewards to the individual of knowledge are very large. So one standard deviation higher in test scores corresponds to 28% higher earnings per year throughout the lifetime. Okay, and that's, as you see at the extreme. Now, the other thing that this says is that lack of knowledge is penalized most in the US. Because if you're below average, you're getting hurt more dramatically in the US than in almost every other country of the world, as you see by this. So this is a story that the tests that we have, in fact, do measure things that we care about, the long-run economic well-being. There's other things, as Susanna points out, but we know this part of it. Now let's look at NAPE. These are NAPE scores, we often say, well, let's get the high school completion rate up, or let's get college attendance up, and assume that that means the same everywhere. But if you do the standard comparison of what scores on NAPE mean that go from Massachusetts to DC, you see that the difference in those scores by the standard equivalence is 2.5 to 3 years of schooling difference at the 8th grade. So that a 8th grader in DC places somewhere at the 5th grade level of Massachusetts. So that all of the policies that we have that are keyed to trying to get high school completion up and so forth are very flawed in the sense that they are misleading on the economic outcomes that you'll get around the US. So let's take those scores and let's turn now to, that's the tests we have seem to have information for economic purposes. Let's turn to what we know about using tests for school accountability. My summary is that bad accountability works. I think that No Child Left Behind was pretty bad accountability, maybe for different reasons than all of you think of it. My reasons are the following. I think it was 180 degrees wrong. It sort of said, states, tell us what you want to produce, and if you don't produce it, we, the federal government, will tell you how to produce it, which is 180 degrees wrong, in my opinion. The federal government has a much better idea of what is possible and what should be accomplished, at least from an economic standpoint, and the states and the localities, as Susanna was talking about, have a much better idea of how to produce it than the federal government. So what do we know about that? Well, we have this list of studies that have tried to look at state test-based accountability and NCLB that includes Susanna's that she didn't even cite in her work. Susanna's studies across states of state accountability that found that stronger provisions for accountability had positive impacts. Some work that I did with Mackie Raymond suggests that consequential accountability, where you hold people responsible as opposed to just providing report cards, has a big impact on growth in NAPE scores. And then Tom D. and Brian Jacob looked at NCLB sort of post-introduction and found positive effects. Now, this is obviously controversial, so the controversy I would put up is the NRC report. We're going to have to ask over dinner Michael of whether his departure from NRC was related to this report or not. This report basically says accountability hasn't worked because the U.S. has not moved to the top of the international ranks. And so it used a, pardon? There's a few people in here that are a little closer implicated to this study. But if you look at this study, which says that accountability is bad, you find that the overall conclusion is that it had positive, although maybe not as large of effects, complete eradication of differences in performance, and that the gains that they cite by the growth analysis I showed you before have a present value equal to 1 GDP, like $15 trillion by the NRC study. So I think that the answer there is that even bad accountability works. Now, there's some international evidence that I would give you also. This is, has to do with looking across countries that have expanded the use of standardized testing for purposes of comparing schools across countries. The horizontal axis says how much have countries changed in their use of external standardized accountability, and the vertical axis is how much did they improve on PISA scores. And what you see there is that countries that have used more standardized testing have done better on PISA. What isn't on this diagram is that other uses of tests or assessments like inspectorates and so forth have no impact on PISA scores, and that it's the standardized testing that seems to have an impact. So let's turn to teachers. That is the other use of tests, and this is where I think all testing became controversial when we talked about putting scores next to teachers. It led to California passing a law that you can never associate student achievement with any teacher. What's the answer we see? So here's an estimate of the economic impact of variations in teacher quality that we have. Teacher quality is measured by value-added scores. We now have quite a number of studies of value-added of teachers, and what we particularly know about is the variation that we see across teachers, which turns out to be fairly consistent across very diverse studies. And so what I've done here is to do two things. I've taken what we know about the variation in teacher quality and put it together with what we know about returns to higher achievement to students in the labor market, and have graphed out the estimates that you get from sort of the existing studies. And they obviously differ by class size or how many students a teacher has. If a teacher only has one student, she's going to have a much smaller effect on the class, on the output than if she has 30 students. And so this line shows you an estimate of the present value of lifetime earnings of a student's class for a 75th percentile teacher. Now, these are comparisons to an average teacher. So how much on the margin does a 75th percentile teacher give you versus an average teacher? And the answer here is for a class of 30, it's $430,000 per year that this 75th percentile teacher is generating by raising the achievement of her class that in fact has long-term lifetime implications by all the studies we've done. Now, the other half of this, of course, is there's a bottom line. So here's a 10th percentile teacher. A 10th percentile teacher with that same class of 30 is subtracting $800,000 in future income compared to an average teacher each year. Okay, so that sort of is my way of setting the stage that differences in these test outcomes seem to have an impact. So the other thing that we know alongside of all of this work on value additive teachers and so forth is that input characteristics tell you nothing. That the background and experience and professional development, et cetera, on average tell you nothing about effectiveness of a teacher. So that immediately says, well, you really can't use input characteristics as we are wont to do to regulate the market, either pay or regulations, setting floors and so forth. If we don't know what counts, it's hard to write the laws, okay? The other thing that I think we have is, the evidence is thinner, but I believe it more strongly than the evidence, and that is that it's pretty easy to tell the really good teachers from the really bad teachers with a lot of confusion in the middle. But there's no doubt in anybody's mind, from principals to teachers to parents to janitors, who are the very best teachers in a school and who are the very worst. It's a matter of, can we find systems that use the information we have to make personnel decisions and make them look fair. And so my answer is that you have to focus on outcomes. You can't focus on inputs. Now, my purpose here is to fill in the details of what Susanna left out of her own work when she did the presentation. So here's a picture that I really like a lot. It's back when there were discussions about laying off teachers, and we had LIFO rules, last in, first out rules. And Susanna did a study on New York City comparing what would happen if you laid off the requisite number of teachers by LIFO rules, and that's the dotted line that mirrors the bell-shaped curve of teacher effectiveness. This is a frequency distribution of teacher effectiveness. And so what you would do is keep the same distribution. You would just take out part of it. As opposed to if you take and get rid of the worst teachers by performance, you dramatically change the average achievement of the distribution. So that's a simulation. Where we do have examples is that we have Washington, D.C., where there are evaluations of teachers, and none of these are all test-based value added. In fact, the majority of DC is not that, but it's evaluating teacher effectiveness in terms of teaching students. And Dee and Wyckoff did the work on Washington, D.C. that I think was pretty conclusive that a system that paid attention to effectiveness helped kids, that in fact achievement of kids in D.C. went up after the introduction of the impact program. There's a little work that I'm doing on Texas, Dallas, Texas now. Dallas completely changed its personnel system to use evaluations of principals and teachers. And one of the things that they've done, it's called the ACE program, and I forget what ACE stands for, but it says take the worst schools you have and reward people who will teach there based upon their effectiveness, their measured effectiveness. And what you see is that those worst schools suddenly rise dramatically when you get effective teachers in, as opposed to paying undifferentiated combat pay, which just draws the average teacher in. And a couple miscellaneous, I can meet your zero time pretty easily here. There's Other aspects of test-based accountability, one is, and it's not as well developed, on principal effectiveness and various views of how you can use test measures generated in schools to rank and rate principals. There's also, I would argue that we've learned about as much in the last 15 years from administrative databases as in the previous 400 years of study that Maris looks at, from generating data that allow us to look at a variety of other aspects of schools. So what are the conclusions? In my view, test-based accountability should play a larger role. I think that the ESSA program is a bad move. It's moving in the wrong direction. I think performance on test is economically significant. There's no doubt about that. I think that even the bad accountability we've had in the past has had a positive impact, and I frankly don't see the alternatives. That's my story.
Yes, exactly. And you're up there. I think it's just the arrows.
Okay, thank you for this opportunity to talk about these two interesting papers. Sure I can figure out how to move us forward here. Not a surprise that these are interesting, well-written papers, since both of the senior authors who we've heard from have track records of conducting important, excellent research on determinants of school effectiveness. And the papers are somewhat different in tone, but not that much in substance. Clearly, Suzanne, her co-author, are more cautious than Rick in terms of their views of how our test scores should be used, but they're not that different. Now, from my perspective, I don't agree really very much with anything in either paper. The papers provide interpretations of the evidence on test-based accountability, and more than that in Susanna's, really looking down from 30,000 feet. Now, I think that's what the authors were asked to do. So, and these long-range views are useful. You can see a lot of the landscape. The papers are publishable, really, as is, in my view, once they add a few missing references to clean up a couple of typos. But there is an opportunity. Now, when I wrote this, I didn't know about the page limits and whether the people running this volume want to provide them with more page limits, or whether perhaps this material is covered in a different paper. If not, I think it should. Really, there's a sentence in Susanna's paper, the context in which measures are applied is also important. Now that's, I think, and Susanna touched on that in her talk, but I think there have been just extraordinary changes in the politics, in the economics, and in the social structure in America that really are relevant to how we look at assessment today. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about and make the case that this belongs somewhere in this volume. So, in changing the politics of education, this is something you all know. In fact, many people we saw in the panel earlier know more about this than I do. But when NAPE was introduced in the late 60s, there was a prohibition against comparisons across states. And state regulations at that time, as Susanna mentioned, were totally focused on inputs. You look today, accountability based on student outcomes is really widely accepted, as is the importance of paying attention to outcomes for vulnerable subgroups. And I think that's really, fundamentally important change that cannot be underestimated. So the question is not whether to pay attention to student outcomes in judging schools, but rather, how do you do it constructively? And ESSA, that Rick doesn't like, represents the most recent of these national experiments providing evidence. But remember, we've got 51 educational systems, if you count the District of Columbia as a 51st. And they operate very differently. Their responses to No Child Left Behind were quite different. And the responses to this newest round of ESCA are going to be different as well. One other big change, these Common Core standards, they become toxic in name in many states. But if you look carefully at the standards states have adopted, they may have different names, but you look at the content, they're just remarkably similar to the Common Core standards. And I think that's important as a perspective within which to view testing. There's much greater agreement, I think, on what we'd like all children to master. Now, so those are changes in the politics, changes in social structure. In my view, the promise of upward socioeconomic mobility has provided the glue that has held our pluralistic democracy together in the midst of high levels of family income inequality. The belief that I may grow up poor, but if I work hard, my kids will not. That's, I think, that's very important for people across the political spectrum. Well, there's recent work, Raj Archetti, who just returned to Harvard, I'm delighted to say, and his colleagues in Science magazine just last year. We estimate rates of absolute income mobility, the fractions of children who earn more than their parents. We find that rates of absolute mobility have fallen from approximately 90% for children born in 1940 to 50% for children born in the 1980s. This is really a quite dramatic change. Now, this is the decline in socioeconomic mobility is not evenly distributed across the country. The darker the color, the worse the situation. That is, the bigger the decline. So that's really, really quite striking. Now, why did this occur? Well, a number of factors, of course, contributed to this. One is increasing residential segregation by income. Work by Raj Chetty and his colleagues really has documented the incredible importance of neighborhood where children grow up. Increasing school segregation by income. Sean Reardon and colleagues have documented that. And increasing evidence that student body composition matters. I'll come back to that in a minute. Increasing income-based gaps in spending on child enrichment. Those who have a lot of money are using an increasing percentage of it just to provide opportunities for their kids in ways that low-income families can't do. And also dramatic changes in the economy, changing the distribution of the nation's jobs and in skill requirements for earning a decent living. So these are all, I think, a piece of the context within which one needs to view test-based accountability. So what's the perspective in designing school and teacher on accountability that at least I want to emphasize? Clearly improving education, especially in high-poverty schools, is critical to the nation's future, and a growing percentage of low-income students are in high-poverty schools. The economic and social changes that have taken place make it more difficult to improve education in high-poverty schools, and I'm going to come back to that. And it's critically important to design accountability systems so they increase the likelihood that children attending high-poverty schools learn the skills that are critical to thriving in a changing American economy and society. So what are these critical skills? Skills measured on standardized tests of English and mathematics matter. That's clearly an emphasis that Rick made in his paper. Also, so do what my colleague David Deming calls social skills, other people sometimes call professional skills, including working productively in a group. A group includes people who don't look like you, being able to stand up and present one's work coherently and articulately, presenting oneself effectively, selling oneself in a job interview. Those clearly are incredibly important in just a whole wide range of jobs. Now, there's lots of evidence that these academic skills matter, and Rick was to that. There's increasing evidence on the importance of these social skills. And I want to talk about that in just a minute. That's David Deming's work. Also, something to keep in mind, this is not to downplay the importance that kids learn reading and math skills, but there's now a number of studies, I can count at least 5, that where there's been interventions aimed at improving life chances for kids from low-income families that have made a difference, but did not change test scores. So it doesn't mean test scores don't matter, but it means really other things matter in schools as well, and I think we need to keep that in mind. So this is from David Deming's work. This is, some of you have seen versions of this. David Otter, Frank Levy, and I have an earlier version. Basically here, what this is showing you is the kind of work that Americans do as the nature of occupations, as the mix of occupations changes. And not the declining line, you know, our routine jobs, filing, bookkeeping, installing left front tires on Fords. Then the red line at the very top are social skills growing in importance, and the blue line is non-routine analytical skills. Now, what's interesting is the second slide, again from David Deming's work, and this is when you mix. What about what happened to jobs that require both high social skills and high academic skills? That's the blue line at the top. The red line is high social skills, low academic skills. They're growing in importance. The green line that's declining is low social skills and high math skills. Well, why is that? Well, that's really technological change based on more rapid computers and storage. For example, example of a task that requires significant cognitive skills, but is typically done alone. In civil law cases, there used to be armies of junior lawyers who spent time on discovery, going through tens of thousands of pages of text looking for evidence. A very large part of that is now computerized. So in the last slide, when you look at what's happened to wages in different occupations, the occupations that require high social and high math skills have increased rapidly, as has the ones that require, occupations that require high social and low math skills. Now, they started out, of course, at a very low base. So I think David's work is really very important in making the case that these social skills or professional skills matter. Now, key question is, are these academic skills that I've summarized with math skills and social skills, are they complements or are they substitutes? And that's clearly, if they're perfect complements, then just to worry about how we measure the academic skills and we're done. If they're substitutes, we need to worry much more about that, and that was something that Susanna talked about. Now, I would argue that there are school pedagogies that facilitate complementarity, and basically this is having students work in small groups, and they can do this, you know, across the subject area, solving math problems in a group, peer review student writing, developing and testing science hypotheses in a group, writing reports, standing up and explaining what your group found, researching and writing reviews of social policies. Now, in most suburban schools in the United States, this is what you'd see, at least in Massachusetts, which is what Laurie suggested, maybe not if I go outside of Massachusetts. You know, as John Baker once said, when asked if he had been to a communist country, he said, no, but I've been to Massachusetts. So I know more about Massachusetts than I know about other states. So one challenge is these student-based pedagogies are very difficult to implement effectively. Very few teachers start out knowing how to do it because that's not the way they were taught. Much greater classroom management challenges when you've got kids working in groups for an extended period of time. So, okay, so keep that in mind. Now, this next slide, this is from a forthcoming paper by 3 economists, Scott Carroll at UC Davis, is the person I've talked with. And basically, it's quite remarkable paper in my view. This is coming out of one of the 3 leading economic journals in the United States. So we examine classroom peer effects by linking administrative data. To distinguish the effect of peers from confounding factors, we exploit the population variance in the proportion of children from families linked to domestic violence. This is basically kids where there's a parent who's asked for a restraining order. And so what happens is if a child is in a classroom with a student who has been exposed to domestic violence at home, we estimate the differential exposure to children linked to domestic violence explains 5% of the rich-poor earnings gap in our data. Each year of exposure to a disruptive peer reduces the present discounted value of classmates' future earnings by $80,000. Remember, this is classmates. This is not the child himself. This is the child's classmates. Now, this, again, is not a surprise to anybody who's been a teacher in a high-poverty school. You know, the challenge that is posed by kids who just come from such difficult families that they just can't sit still, and they're very disruptive. Now, I asked Scott Carroll, how is this related to socioeconomic status of the student body? So Scott generated for me that graph, and the horizontal axis is the percentage of kids in the school eligible for free reduced price lunch. The vertical axis is the percentage of kids in the school who have been exposed to domestic violence at home. And you can see that curve rises and it gets more steep as you get closer to the end. So that's really, so basically if you're in a high poverty school, a school serving high percentages of poor kids, you're going to have a significant number of students in your classroom. In the class of 25, you're likely to have at least 2 kids who basically, are disruptive, not because they're bad human beings, but because of the toxic stress they've experienced in their lives outside of school. And the consequences of that really are quite severe. So it's very difficult to have students work productively in groups in the presence of disruptive peers. If group work is frequently disrupted, students don't learn anything, either academic or social skills. So under those circumstances, an enormous tendency for teachers to move to teacher-centered pedagogy to reduce classroom management challenges. This, if done well, will improve scores in the reading and math tests, but it doesn't help the development of the social skills that are also very important. So test-based accountability with high stakes in situations in which school faculties lack the resources to deal with a significant number of really troubled students, and the knowledge of how to do it does not promote either academic skills or social skill development. Now, in my view, for these reasons, incentives and capacity building need to be critical complements, especially in high poverty schools. So I think looking at test-based accountability by itself is not sensible. You really need to think of it as part of a package, and that includes support for teachers, particularly in these high poverty schools. Now, clearly attracting teaching talent is critically important, as Rick has emphasized in many things that he read. Importantly, where beginning teachers are placed matters an awful lot. A very nice paper by Caribou Jackson, a co-author. Again, not a big surprise. Being in a school in which you have experienced teachers at the same grade level who can provide support, that matters. Work by John Pape and Matt Kraft shows the same general pattern. The extent to which a school is a learning organization has a big impact on the extent to which novice teachers develop. Also, while I agree with Rick, most professional development is a day off for the kids and not useful in terms of improving teaching. However, a lot's been learned about what effective teacher development looks like, that it has to be very concrete, very skill-based, has to be long-term. There are interesting studies done, Eric Taylor and John Pape and Tyler. So we know much more about how to do that than we did, but still, I would agree, not enough schools do that. But I would argue it's absolutely critical. But one thing that we have learned is, and I think the role of school principals. And I think, I remember, Rick, you're being asked a question at the National Institute of Economic Research, probably 25 years ago, do principals matter? And you said no. But again, Rick, being the good scholar that he is, does new work and that informs his views, and he now has a very different answer now. But I would emphasize that part of the role of effective school principal is not only to push out teachers who don't get better, but it's creating this culture of learning in which teachers can learn from each other and get better. Because the idea of school as a set of egg crate classrooms, to use the Dan Lordy term from now many years ago, really we know doesn't make sense, particularly in the context of a high poverty school. Because if the third grade teacher and the fourth grade teacher each have different strategies for teaching a core skill, such as division of fractions, but these strategies are different, that's incredibly confusing to kids who don't have support at home. So making instruction more coherent and consistent is a key piece of the challenge, and that requires strong leadership as a necessary condition to make that happen. So I think we need to know, there's a lot to be learned, especially how to support and hold accountable high poverty schools, again, where the stakes are highest. The potential for good is the greatest, the potential for damage is the greatest. We need longer run studies. An awful lot of these studies, including of the DC impact, they're short term. And no question that those results are positive, but the question is, once if you have absolutely bottom test scores, getting them up a bit is a lot easier than continuing to make progress once the kind of low-hanging fruit is picked. So we need to follow up and have longer-term studies. So I'm one sentence away. So so I think whether there's the authors have the energy and the organizing the volume, want to give them the space to deal with these issues of how, when you look down from 30,000 feet, you don't see the deteriorating situation in the schools attended by low-income kids. But I think, again, given the growth in family income inequality, the decline in mobility, that needs to be a piece of how we think about test-based accountability and the use of assessments. So, thank you.
So can I ask the three of you to sit up there and face interrogation? I started by querying why it is that economists get involved in accountability. I now have some short answers to myself, which I'll share with you. One is because economists care about something called the political economy, or political economy, by which, translated into our context, that means issues related to whether something like accountability, which is fundamentally a political, cultural, historical part of the American way of life, is handled better through market-based mechanisms or regulatory and bureaucratic mechanisms. That's something that economists care deeply about. It's what we call put into the political economy of testing. The second part of the political economy has to do with the possibility, and this comes up a lot in, I think in particular in Susanna and her colleagues' paper, that testing is, like most measures, imperfect, and there are possibly downside risks associated with it, and therefore the question, which economists really have done a huge amount of work on in other sectors, not just education, has to do with whether the downside risks are so bad that justifies not using a particular kind of technology, such as testing, at all. And if the answer to that is, well, we're not sure, that's where some better measurement of the effects of testing and of the downside effects of testing becomes very significant, which is what I think these papers are partly about, in particular, Susanna's paper. The other thing about economics, of course, is that economists care about economic outcomes, and education has economic outcomes. So I don't think anybody here would want to argue with that. There is so much abundant evidence, internationally and nationally, on the marginal improvement in a society's well-being and in individual earnings and in other of those kinds of outcomes that comes from education, that no wonder we economists care about looking at the outcomes. All the rest of this is, of course, I think, a matter of figuring out where to set the dial on the uses of certain kinds of measures to provide information to us about how we're doing in terms of those outcomes, and as importantly, to provide us with some guidance as to whether the use of these measures themselves are distorting the behaviors that we care most about in education. And at some point, not this afternoon, but now that we have these papers, this is partly the way I'm going to, I hope, try to frame some continuing analysis of this. I want to just thank the authors again, and thank Dick for very thoughtful, as always, and compelling and sensible. Dick's and Greg Duncan's short book on restoring opportunity has a suggestion in there for something called sensible accountability. And I think what you've done, Dick, here is a very sensible discussion of these papers. Questions, comments, have at the group here, please. They're tough, they can take it, come on. Let's, yes, Bill Trent.
The question so much is something to add to some of the discussions of the social implications of the rising gap in poverty and so on.
Start that over again when we have the...
This is more a comment on the changing social dynamics in terms of poverty in communities. And we have to be aware of the growing number of children who are not just more exposed to violence, but they are increasingly wards of the state. And this happens a great deal in communities.
Put the microphone just a little closer to where you're speaking from.
All right. I'll say it even shorter. We need to understand what the implications are for increasing number of kids who are wards of the state, especially as they are in high poverty schooling context.
So I agree completely with that, Bill. The one thing that where I somewhat different in emphasis from Dick is that I don't think that our problem is entirely confined to high poverty schools. As I look at the data, the differences in achievement between high income and low income parents has not changed over the last 30 or 40 years. And so that we've had a persistent problem of dealing with poverty, but we have a persistent problem with dealing with achievement at other points in the distribution too. And so if we completely emphasize poverty schools, I think that's a huge mistake.
Did anybody else want to comment on that from here? Okay. Yes. Bill.
Rick, a lot of what's in your inputs model, I wanted to start there, talk a little bit about inputs and opportunities. Not surprising. Of course, these are the things that we want to look at, professional development and teacher certification things, and finding those as non-significant are, I think, important. But one thing that's not on your list that relates to some of the findings that were presented later are things like, how about the degree of school integration? Racial integration in the school as an input, right? So, and I think one of the reasons we don't see these things on these lists is because these aren't politically viable solutions. We're not even thinking about trying to think about integrated schools as a policy lever, and it is an input, and it ought to be on our list. We ought to be looking at these kinds of things. So that's one comment. But related to that is opportunity. And Rick, one of the findings you talk about is these sorts of observation schemes where teachers get feedback, and there's some evidence of that effectiveness. Well, to me, you could talk about this as input at some level, but it's really what's the opportunity to learn in the classroom. And Susanna mentioned that test accountabilities, it could help a district decide whether districts are providing opportunities. But I'd actually say none of our systems have adequate data on opportunity to learn in the classroom. The observational schemes are beginning to generate that, but we don't look at those things as the drivers of what, how we ought to improve instruction. So I think we have to be careful about inputs and opportunities and really think more broadly about that and ask ourselves, how would we get better if all we have is yield data, as it was put in the first session? Like, that's the only kind of data we have in the system to get better. And we don't have how the system is actually functioning in terms of what students encounter in the classroom as opportunities to learn. So I wonder if you guys have comments
So let me
on that.
respond to both quickly. On desegregation, I am on record as thinking that we have a real problem there, and it's not on the list because the courts of this land have made it very difficult to think of how you deal with school desegregation. And it's not on the list because I was just looking at teacher aspects as opposed to desegregation is a somewhat larger aspect. I think that's a disaster, the way we've gotten to the point where we are. I understand the legal decisions in some ways, but I think it's a bad outcome, social outcome. On the second point, I guess I need more help because I'm a narrow economist. I don't understand what opportunity means and what you're meaning by that.
What it really means is, what are the qualities of the assignments that I'm getting? Am I getting some of the kinds of collaborative learning opportunities that might yield better learning? Is it focused on disciplinary core ideas, engaging students in practices? And that's the kind of data I think we're sorely lacking in classrooms, and we do have some evidence, like from the Met study, that these kinds of things happen quite a bit.
So I think that those things are important. In some ways, I view the measures we do have in the classroom as being summary measures, that if you have crappy opportunity to learn, you don't learn, and that we, in fact, are observing whether people learn. Now, there's other aspects to them, as Dick brought out, about other things that we might care about, and I completely agree with that, and that's why I completely agree with people who say we should not just use value-added measures to evaluate teachers. There's a lot more to it, and that's what we've seen in the systems that work. But it's a package. That's a research question in my mind of things we should be getting at. Right now, we have some answers, and my thoughts are we ought to do what we know how to do now, because there's not very little evidence that it's going to cause harm, but there's a lot of evidence that it'll cause good.
I just wanted to follow up on that too. So maybe this is just repeating what I said before, but I think we've got these these kind of big goals for kids. Part of it is experience, but right now I'm thinking about what the kinds of skills they're developing, the things you're talking about for opportunity, and part of it is economic and part of it isn't. But whatever it is, that's what we care about. The movement to measures, I think, is where the tricky part is, and that's why I tried to emphasize that some of the distinction between process measures and outcome measures really is a question of how well they're capturing this kind of end goal here and helping in improvement. And so you have to, just because, yes, you want opportunities to learn, doesn't mean we can measure it well. So maybe on this thing like reliability, it's like portfolios. I think many times we thought, oh, portfolios for students because they're so much better, but they turn out to be the only reliable part of it is the same as what test scores is, so why go through all that problem? And so I think there are these measurement issues that all of you know better than I do, but that it's really a question of these long-run outcomes. Okay, so that's my general framework for thinking of it. That said, so a bunch of states in early childhood, certainly, the measures that they're doing are on the observation about what goes on in the classroom. And I think that's because the test measures are one-on-one. They're too expensive. So for the benefits of accountability at that level, the better measure determined right now is actually to go in and observe it, to observe a classroom, because at least you can observe a whole classroom. In K-12, I think it's still up in the air whether some of these outcome measures or some of these observational measures are actually more useful. I think in teachers that you're right, that some of the measures that have led allowed for the studies that Dick pointed to, like John Pepe and Eric Taylor's study recently, where they went into Tennessee and they matched teachers based on what their observation scores were. They needed those observation scores, they used them, but they're still using those for accountability. So that was probably a little bit stream of consciousness, but just the idea is that you're balancing these qualities of education, of measures towards your big goals, and sometimes it's going to be test scores. And just because it's not perfect, again, it's because the measures that you're thinking of, I think we may not be able to do that in a real way at a large scale. And actually have it be beneficial. You know, maybe the extra money that it would cost us to do those kind of measures would be better spent on the professional development for teachers.
We have Maris, and then Mike Nettles is in the queue after that. Anybody else? Henry? Okay, that's all I can remember.
Well, this was a terrific panel, and I think we all learned a lot. I just want to make a commentary on the role of the states. When you talk about the role of the states, I think you would help the readers or whoever you're doing to point out the times it worked and the times it didn't work. So, for example, if you make a mistake and you favor segregation at the state level or other kinds of things that some of us would consider bad, that's not a good time to have states take that thing. And you have to remember that the public is actually very split on a lot of these issues. So if you give it to the states, you may give it to some states that will go very different to your values. All I'm saying is it's worth pointing out to people this. Secondly, I think it's very important to realize that this is very much bound by what time period you're talking about. I would not give much control to the states in the late 19th century. You would not get much results from that, given the nature of the states and the governors. When you get up to 1960s, then it becomes a really open question. They really debated whether to give as much control to the states on ESCA, but they couldn't come up with a better finding. Now, is it different today? This issue comes up all of the time for policymakers. So we gave control of Head Start to local areas, local communities. In retrospect, that may have been a mistake. They were going to do even more of that in the 70s to emphasize the role of these entities. So I think it'd be very instructive to talk about under what circumstances, what conditions, and where this fit. Too often, it sounds like we're really just saying, yes, it's good to have centralization and support of states, but a lot of times you can have reading courses that are dictated at the state level that may be a mistake.
That's a really nice point. I actually wasn't trying to make a normative judgment in the paper at all, just a legal statement that states have the constitutional control over the education system. The way things like Head Start are just the federal government giving money, they can do that, but the control and...
I don't think the states in the Constitution were given control necessarily. At a point in time, they were interpreted that way.
But isn't that just because the Constitution says if it's not given to the federal government, it goes to the states?
I'm glad you pointed that out, because that clause was deliberately written ambiguously. Hamilton tried to get that clause passed because he wanted more state, more control of the federal government. And so he said, oh, no, this is just incidental. And then after the public bought it, he changed his mind. So I'll be careful.
So I
Okay,
mean, I agree.
can I just suggest that
yeah.
this was another good one for dinner?
Yeah. I'm just trying to not have to.
Frankly,
be
I would
loaded on
take
the
either of the
state
two
rule.
of you over the current Supreme Court nominee, but I don't think that's on the table here. Mike Nettles.
Okay, so I have two questions. One about, one is more of an economics-based question, and the other one about testing or assessment. And I'm curious about some of the research now. I've become more interested lately because we've had a equity committee on student and teacher assessment at ETS for the past 2 years. It's going to be sunset pretty soon. I mean, it was designed to go out of existence. But one of the things that we talked about was how testing experts think about developing assessments and how confident they can get when compared to lay people who are looking at it for the first time. One example is when in the field test for a new assessment, we looked after the fact at the samples that were used for the assessment in the field test. What we discovered was a very small number of Hispanic people in the field test, underrepresentation of African Americans. We don't know about people of poverty. In your analysis of these gains in student achievement, do you ever get concerned about how the tests are constructed, whether in fact people were adequately represented in the pre-test development process, how that contributes to maybe the scaling and the ultimate value of the test? I mean, because these tests are responses very often to RFPs from the states, right? There's a competition, and very often in the literature, you get the impression that after that's over, it doesn't really matter anymore. It's just every test is equal for the kind of analysis you've been conducting. So that's one question. The other question has to do, and I don't want to co-opt our colleague who was asking about opportunity, but it made me think about investment. So when Eric was talking about the relationship between the outcomes and earnings in a country, it made me wonder whether you include or ever consider investment and make differentiation among the types of investments that people are making in education. One example, for example, these days is China compared to India. We're seeing China invest an awful lot of money in education, regardless of how you measure, and India not. And the question would be, something like, are they getting different results? Does the type of investment they're making make a difference?
Okay, Mike actually snuck two questions into his one opportunity to ask. So you guys take that
You do
on.
the second, or I'll do.
I'll do the second, yeah.
So of course, I worry about validity on all measures, even though my dissertation is based on a 7-word vocabulary test across a century, which has no validity. So yes, I mean, I worry about that, and along with a lot of things, but I think it just all fits in the framework of is the measure, the measures are going to be imperfect, how imperfect, and what are the implications of it? The rest is
So
yours.
my work is all designed to try to bring up the discussion of investment to the surface and talk about how we invest more. I think you're absolutely correct that 25 years from now, China is going to be so far ahead of India that it won't even be be a matter of discussion because they're investing a lot more, even though they've had the same growth rates for the last 15 years. China's going to keep going and India isn't because of this investment. And the work that I gave you maybe could be related to prior investment, but it just sort of says where we are, here's what you get. And then the discussion is how do we get to a better position, which I think is the future of the U.S.
Dick, do you want to get in on this one? No. Henry.
Thank you. When I think about what Dick argued around the importance of context, and particularly the nature and setting of the classrooms, particularly in high-poverty schools, and the problems and challenges that students bring with them into the classroom, doesn't that suggest that this focus on test-based accountability is too narrow, and that if we really want to make a difference, we really have to take a much broader approach dealing with the social economic context in which students live? So something, whether it's the By All Means project at Harvard or the broader Boulder approach, that if we ignore those extra academic considerations, there are real limits to what we can accomplish, particularly in high poverty schools where we see such a conflation, if you will, of both financial and social resources in comparison to students in middle class or upper middle class schools. So are we not just focusing where we think we have the light, but it's not where the real problem is?
So I wouldn't agree. That if you look at various studies of the value added of teachers, there is as much variation within schools as between schools. And so what it says to me is that the high poverty schools are achieving at a lower level, but the variation in teacher quality there is just as high as you see other places. It's just disguised. And the argument that I see in better, bolder, brighter, whatever it is that we shouldn't pay so much attention to the effectiveness of teachers and other things because there are all these social problems. And until we redistribute all of income, we won't make any progress. And I think that's just the wrong policy answer.
I also don't think accountability goes in by itself. I mean, usually it's aligned with choosing the goals that you care about and putting professional development in. There's funding. It's not really I don't think anybody would support the only thing we do. We turn schools loose and test kids. I don't think that's the right comparison. I think, is it a useful part of the kind of system you set up for hopefully continuously improving schools? And I do think that we would be better off in terms of the inequalities we have by redistributing income. But again, I don't think that we need to wait until we redistribute income to try to do some other things as well. No, but that would be an example. Or, you know, in any event, you want to look at everything at once, and this is just one element of it. I don't think that it necessarily has to be on its own, or that it ever is on its own.
Okay, I'm about to be held accountable for whether
okay.
we make it to dinner on time.
Just a minute.
Okay.
Just a minute. It is also true that on average, we spend more per pupil in high poverty schools than in the least poverty schools. Now, we might not spend enough more, but we've tried that solution. New Jersey is the best example.
We're going to pass on the final round of comments because unless Dick Murnane wants to, since you're not coming to dinner, you can add another sentence or two here before we close.
Thank you. I agree with Rick. Clearly that the challenges facing high poverty schools are not the only K-12 education problem in the United States. I mean, that's surely true. But on the other hand, given what's happened in the United States in recent decades, I think it's critical that accountability policies reduce income-based performance gaps rather than widen them. And I think doing so requires paying close attention to the extraordinary challenges that arise when high proportions of the nation's most troubled kids are concentrated in the same schools.
Thank you. I just want to add one point of personal privilege here. No, this will take.
How can you do that? How can you do it?
In approximately 1976, I was Dick Murnane's teaching assistant, and the book we read was Hanya, Sheck, and Jackson. 10-minute break.